Now for today's program. Ambassador Karen Kornblue has helped shape public policy since the early days of the commercial internet as a public servant and diplomat. She served as U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris during the Obama administration. During the Clinton administration, she served as both Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Treasury Department and Director of the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs at the Federal Communications Commission. Ambassador Kornblue is now Senior Fellow and Director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She also chairs the boards of Radio Free Europe and the Open Technology Fund. Ambassador Kornblue was recently named one of Washingtonian Magazine's top influencers. Jessica Reeves is the Director of Content and Editorial Strategy for the ADL Center on Extremism. She has written extensively about the foundational role of misogyny within a range of extremist groups and movements, including incels and white supremacy. Before joining the Center on Extremism in 2014, Jessica was a reporter for more than 15 years, covering politics, the U.S. Supreme Court, and global health, as a staff writer for the Chicago Tribune, Ms., the Chicago News Cooperative, and Time.com, among others. Journalist Sarah Posner is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. Her investigative reporting has appeared in Rolling Stone, Vice, The Nation, Mother Jones, The New Republic, and HuffPost, among many others. Her coverage and analysis of politics and religion has appeared in many outlets, including the New York Times, The Washington Post, and Politico. Sarah is the author of Unholy: How White Christian Nationalists Powered the Trump Presidency and the Devastating Legacy They Left Behind. Please welcome Karen Kornblue, Jessica Reeves, and Sarah Posner.
I'm really honored to be here with these two experts on this very timely and important topic. And I encourage everybody who's watching to, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible over the course of the hour that we have together. So I wanted to start with just kind of laying a basic framework here for us to have this conversation today. With asking you, Jessica, can you explain for us what is great replacement theory and why is it in the news so much right now?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to appear on this panel with such amazing women. So thank you. Yeah, so the great replacement theory is something that we all wish we had never heard of, but unfortunately we now have. The theory, as it goes, follows that white people are being replaced in the United States and also in Europe by unseen forces, by non-white immigrants. And that is fundamentally changing the demographics of those places. Now, there are two essential iterations of the great replacement theory. One is the white supremacist theory, and you will see this reflected in the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto. You see it reflected in the shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's this idea that Jews are orchestrating a replacement of white people in order to carry out their own nefarious goals and purposes in Europe and the United States. Then there's sort of a mainstream version of this, which we will see frequently discussed on some news channels, including Fox. And that one holds that there is a invasion of non-white immigrants who are changing the fabric of American society and taking away rights and safety, et cetera, for traditional Americans. And this is all couched in very sort of careful language, but it's very easy once you're familiar with the theory to spot it in a lot of these places.
So would you say that both iterations of this conspiracy theory have provoked people to violent acts?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is, there's a misunderstanding that if something is not explicitly white supremacist, people believe, oh, well, then it can't actually can't lead to violence. It can't provoke these horrible attacks. That's patently false. There is an encouragement of violence. There is a provocation of violence in a lot of this language. If you talk about just the words that are used, invasion, taking over, destroying, there are all these words that are meant to get people angry. They're meant to make people upset. And that is all rooted in this idea that if they can cause action, they can provoke action, then things will change, the path will change. So both iterations of the Great Replacement theory are incredibly toxic. They are incredibly anti-American. They are opposed to all of the pluralistic ideals that America is theoretically supposed to stand for. So they're both very dangerous.
So how was it, how did it become apparent that the shooter in Buffalo who shot and killed 11 Black people in a supermarket there about a month ago, how did it become apparent that he was a follower of this, or he had adopted this?
Right. So pretty immediately after the news of the shooting broke, Center on Extremism analysts were looking at and combing through the manifesto that he had published online. And he had, published this immediately before the shooting so that everybody could read it. And this is certainly something we see happening very frequently with these shooters, is that they're trying to attain some sort of infamy. And unfortunately, that has happened to some extent. But the manifesto was hugely mimicking that of the Christchurch shooter. And we noticed there was
the shooter in New Zealand a few years ago.
The shooter in New Zealand who targeted the 2 mosques and killed 52 people. Those 2 manifestos overlap about 60% of the time. So there was just a lifting of this idea that these non-white people had come into New Zealand in the case of the New Zealand shooter, and in America in the case of the Buffalo shooter, and we're taking away rights and space and resources for real Americans or real New Zealanders. And so you saw this reflected, and it wasn't just like happenstance that they happened to use the same language. They are mimicking each other, and they are providing blueprints to one another of how to carry out these attacks, as well as how to frame it within this white supremacist conspiracy theory.
Okay. And so do we know where, had the Christchurch shooters manifesto been shared online? Where would this 18-year-old, I think, who was the shooter in Buffalo, how would he have found that? And how easily could he have found it?
Oh, these manifestos are incredibly easy to find. They are, the Buffalo shooter actually live streamed his attack on Twitch, which is also mimicking previous shooters. This happened to be in Halle, Germany. The shooter who attempted to attack a synagogue but couldn't get in because the doors were locked. He instead shot some people in the street outside the synagogue. But his attack was live streamed on Twitch, as was the beginning of the Buffalo shooter's attack. That link was quickly disabled, but it just shows the extent to which people, that these shooters are looking for fame. They want to make sure that they are having an impact. They want to make sure their names are known. And so this spreads like wildfire. I mean, you can find the Christchurch manifesto verbatim on many sites. And we know that the Buffalo shooter, by his own admission, was radicalized on 4chan, which is a site that where you post, it's an image board site, essentially, where you can post anonymously. And it is not extremist in and of itself, but it has hosted and been the birthplace of many, many, many extremist memes that have, really given a lot of voice to racism and white supremacy and anti-Semitism and misogyny and, across the board. So it's a place where a lot of toxic language and memes go to, be celebrated or come out of. So we saw the Buffalo shooter being radicalized there, he used Discord, he used Twitch, he used 4chan. So that's 3 sort of, ways that he was getting into this system and ways that he was sharing his toxic ideology and toxic plans with other people. So that is an illustration of exactly how easy it is to find all of this. Bits and pieces of the shooting, the video, were still available online in the most graphic and horrifying detail a week after the shooting. So that in Buffalo. So that shows how many holes there are in our attempts to make the internet safer and less toxic and less damaging. But it also shows how easy it is for these people to find each other.
Right. And that, so he, even though he was working, you could say he was working in concert with other white supremacists who were perpetuating these conspiracy theories and these provocations to violence online. He went out alone. There was another incident over the weekend where people organized together from across many different states, from as far away as Texas and Virginia, to converge on a pride festival in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And that was organized by a group called Patriot Front. And do we have evidence that those individuals, I mean, obviously it would be hard to organize, I think, people from across all of those different states to converge on Idaho without social media?
Right. Yeah, Patriot Front is among the white supremacist groups that use a lot of these forums, a lot of these messaging services very freely. There was a huge leak earlier this year of some of their conversations, which was really damaging to them and their infrastructure. It was released to a lot of extremism experts and researchers, and that was a huge sort of win for researchers. But it showed the extent to which they do rely on social media to organize these events. We saw that, we've seen that for years. We saw it with certainly manifesting most clearly right before Charlottesville in 2017. The Unite the Right rally saw just this massive outpouring of planning and messaging and, like spreadsheets being shared, and so much happened online prior to Charlottesville. And that is the gift and the curse of the internet, right? Is that it allows all of us to be parts of communities that are far flung. And that's wonderful in some ways because it connects us closer together, but it also means that these white supremacists are using those same methodologies to plan and orchestrate these events. And as you said, the arrests of the 31 members of Patriot Front in Idaho this weekend was a huge blow to that organization, but was also just a, as far as we understand it, what came from a tip, a citizen saying like, hey, something weird is happening here. This was not like some big expose of like planning mechanisms. It was just somebody being alert and saying, hey, something weird is going on with this truck and these guys. You should probably look into it. So
Right. And just briefly, and I think we're going to return to this topic a little later, but to what extent does homophobia and transphobia play a role in all of these movements? Because obviously they were targeting a Pride festival during Pride Month.
Yeah. It's interesting. I actually was just talking to a reporter this morning about how, about the threads of misogyny that are woven through a lot of these groups. And you cannot talk about homophobia without talking about misogyny and vice versa, because, everything that is targeting the LGBTQIA community is also about sort of traditional iterations of gender roles or traditional masculinity, or, anyone who dares step outside those bounds is going to be targeted by these guys, because these men are deeply, deeply invested in masculinity as it is traditionally defined. And they are very invested in making sure that women stay, quote, in their place. And, this thread is just throughout white supremacy writ large. It's a very traditionalist, very sort of regressive movement. And in that sense, they are also very much opposed to any deviation from what they consider to be traditional norms. And certainly the LGBTQIA population falls within that and is going to be targeted as well.
And is there a relationship between their anti-Semitism and their homophobia and transphobia?
Absolutely, yeah. They these white supremacist groups, just as they will take the Great Replacement theory, this idea of demographic change, and blame it on the Jews, everything can be blamed on the Jews if you're a white supremacist. Just as they will do that, they will take any sort of social change that does not directly benefit straight white men and blame it on the Jews. So Jewish people are to blame for feminism. They're to blame for women getting too big for their britches. They are to blame for the civil rights movement. So much power is imbued into the Jewish community, which I guess is, really nice. But on the other hand, it's totally unrealistic and is anti-Semitic at its core, because, you're ascribing this power, this very nefarious power, to a group of people it's totally unrealistic, but it also means that you can blame them for every single thing that you disagree with in society. And that creates an incredibly dangerous dynamic. And it's why we saw, the shooter in Pittsburgh who targeted the Tree of Life synagogue. He targeted a synagogue because he believed that Hias, that helps immigrants and brings them here and sets them up and gives them a life. He believed that they were to blame and that they were connected to this synagogue. And therefore, that made sense to him. So it's this very twisted sort of, the anti-Semitism infuses absolutely everything within white supremacy. And it's just, it would be kind of astonishing and amazing if it weren't so horrifying to see how they twist themselves into knots, making sure that they can blame the right people for all of these supposed ills.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. So Karen, you have studied what it is about social media that enables not only this kind of sharing, but the radicalization of individuals in the first place. And I don't know that we know precisely how the Buffalo shooter, for example, came upon these writings on the internet, but a lot of what's been studied about how social media, and in particular Facebook, work. I think we have some information about how these sorts of ideas or radical group membership in radical group Facebook groups gets pushed out to people, even if they're not looking for it. So Karen, can you talk about that a little bit? Talk about how we have discovered that about the way the algorithms at Facebook work, and what an algorithm is, and why we should care about how the algorithms are set up.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks so much for including me. This is such a great and important discussion. So I come out of the tech policy space and have been, working in one way or another around internet policy, tech policy since the very early days of the internet. And something that Jessica said is so important, that there's a lot of that's great about the internet. It connects us in a way, it makes life much easier to connect us. It means that we have much more freedom of expression than we had before. You don't have to go through a gatekeeper in order to publish your thoughts. And I think often the conversation about the internet is very stymied because we think we can't address any of the problems without killing everything that's good. And so one of the things that we've been working on is, okay, what are the real problems that have a public policy answer or an answer from the platforms that wouldn't hurt First Amendment principles, that wouldn't hurt free expression? So what are the harms that have a public policy component to them, and what are the solutions that make sense? So, so this problem runs across social media. We, as you alluded, though, we have a little bit more information about Facebook because of the whistleblower. The Facebook whistleblower was someone who was employed at Facebook, who left and brought a bunch of documents. And it just so happened that Facebook, to their credit, had been studying what was happening on their own platform. And so we have access to that. But some of the things, but this is true in different formations on YouTube, on Twitter, and then it's especially on these more marginal platforms that Jessica was talking about. But let me start with a story that comes out of the Facebook papers. Facebook ran an experiment, to their credit. They created a fake account for a fictional user. Her name was Carol Smith. She was a 41-year-old conservative mother from North Carolina. This account, this fake account, was recommended by their own system, pages and groups related to QAnon, the conspiracy theory, within days of its creation. And then within 3 weeks, Carol was recommended an account associated with the militia group 3%ers. And so what this and other studies really told the Facebook researchers is that their design itself is creating radicalization and hate speech. And that on the other end, their content moderation, when they try to take down stuff, so, you know, this engine is pushing the extremism, and then on the other end, they're trying to take it down. Some of the research also showed that their efforts at finding it and taking it down were wholly inadequate to even comply with their own standards. So I think if we think of it in that product design way, that's something that we're used to thinking about in other industries. You know, the FDA looks at the design of drugs, or food. We look at food safety, or how an airplane engine is going to work. And what the Facebook researchers showed is that the core product mechanics, including virality, so you've heard about things going viral, recommendations, how something winds up in your news feed. It's not just your friends that are in your news feed or what your friends recommend. The algorithm, the system recommends things based on whether they think you'll stay online, because at its base, Facebook, like broadcast television before it, is about serving you ads. And so they want you to stay online as long as possible. So if this algorithm, this machine is getting signals that this piece of content keeps people online, they'll recommend it. They'll put it into your news feed, almost like an editor, but not editing for what's newsworthy, editing for what's going to keep you online. And what a lot of research has shown is that things that gin up your emotions are going to keep you online. And also things that are not well known to others. So, oh, you listen to this, you'll never believe, you know, and you'll share it and stay online. And the research has shown that optimizing in this way for engagement are key to why hate and misinformation flourish on the platform. And I've called this safety design flaw, algorithmic radicalization. And what at heart it is about is manipulation, you know, because you don't know why something's being recommended to you, and you think it's being recommended because it's coming from a reputable outlet, or it's coming from a friend, or it's the consensus of the crowd. And in fact, it's coming at you for a variety of reasons that have to do with somebody, you know, wanting to radicalize you, wanting to sell you something, the algorithm wanting to keep you online. And then on the other end, the platforms, when they try to enforce their terms of service, which say we don't allow these kinds of nudity and we don't allow this kind of hate speech, they perform this kind of whack-a-mole at the other end, and it really doesn't work. Somebody I work with who's in the vaccine community said he feels as though the conspiracy theorists use the engine of social media and public health officials are fighting the engine of social media. And a key example of this was early on in COVID, there was a video called America's Frontline Doctors. It was full of conspiracy theories about Fauci, about COVID, and it reached something like 20 million interactions on Facebook, or views, I can't remember which, on Facebook, before being taken down by all the platforms. All the major platforms took it down because they all decided it violated their terms of service, but it had reached tens of millions of people
already, right?
Already, because they had to review it, and you know they didn't put a pause on it, and the system just kept recommending it. And this happened with Stop the Steal too, you know, where we saw these groups metastasize and grow and grow and grow, even though they eventually decided to take them down. So the whack-a-mole really doesn't work. So I've rambled on. I'm sorry. It's probably answered 4 questions.
That's good. Right now. So I guess something that I'm really curious about that I feel like I've never gotten a good answer to. So I understand in a way, right? I mean, I don't understand it, but I get it. That Facebook likes you to get enraged because that enhances your engagement with the platform. And so that might be why the algorithm serves you up news articles or opinion articles that might, you know, get your blood boiling. I don't really understand what it is about the algorithm that would serve a housewife from North Carolina a militia, you know, to the possibility of joining a militia. How does that happen?
Yeah, so I think it was ADL that studied some stuff on YouTube and found they were, was it ADL? They were, or maybe it was a different group, that they were serving up various militia-related things to people who are, as the report put it, militia curious. I mean, I shouldn't laugh because it's kind of horrifying, but I mean, part of what these complicated algorithms that we're not going to understand today do is they find out what your interests are, what you know, and you put down a bunch of interests. And sometimes when you sign on to one of these platforms, they'll recommend you start a channel or a page or a group that's related to one of these extremists, or they'll recommend some of these, you know, hateful groups, because it's not, the algorithm isn't really thinking. It's not an editor like an editor in a newspaper. It's just finding out what. And it, you know, it's often very confused. I mean, you know, you've gotten ads online that you are things you're really not interested in, or a pair of slippers that you bought yesterday is being advertised to you today. The machines are far from perfect, but they're picking up all kinds of signals based on where you live and what magazines you subscribe to, and mostly what you do online. And and then they're also picking up signals about this piece of content and how it's performed and who has responded to it. And they're putting that, it puts all that together in a machine, and it decides this is what you might be interested in, and this is what might keep you online. And the platforms, you know, they do have rules, and they are trying. I don't think they're trying to create extremism, but they are really, really hesitant with not allowing content to be online and not allowing people to speak online. So they put their free expression responsibility first. And I think they also, I think they don't want to be in the business of saying what's true, what's not true, what's bad, what's not bad. And they're in a very weird situation, you know, where they're adjudicating, because they're so big, as the mainstream platforms are so big and they've become so important. And they don't have First Amendment responsibilities. It's the government.
They're not the government, right?
But still, they're big gatekeepers. And so I think they feel the responsibility of not taking it down, and people work the ref. So they get a lot of blowback when they do take action. And a lot of what their content moderators are underpaid, often contractors, seeing millions of pieces of content that are horrific, you know, violent stuff, nudity, and they're taking all that down. But this political stuff, I think, is just, you know, it's all shades of gray, and it's very, very difficult for them. And
well,
I think
the content moderators, they're not people like Jessica who are experts on all these different permutations of white supremacist rhetoric, right? And so they might read something and think it's in some kind of gray area in terms of like whether it's something that falls within. So it's hard to blame the content moderators. It seems more like the issue is around how the social media companies have been, how the social media platforms have been designed for maximum anxiety or maximum outrage.
Right. I think two things. I think one, it's the algorithm that's not really, but what I'd like to stress is how it's not transparent. So that when you go online, you don't know why certain things are being recommended to you. You don't know about Carol. You don't know that, you know, on Twitter, they actually give you a choice if you just want to see things chronologically by the people that you follow, or whether you want the algorithm to work on you. And that, just giving you that choice, is hugely educational, because otherwise I don't think people would know that it isn't chronological. Similarly, you know, there used to be this ad in this cartoon in the New Yorker. It showed a dog at a computer, and it said, "When you're on the internet, no one knows you're a dog." You know, these outlets that appear to be, you know, following traditional journalistic outlets, often are posing as local outlets, and they're actually, you know, fronts for corporations that are using algorithms to generate stories. Groups, the largest pages in the 2020 election, focusing on African American audiences and Christian American audiences, were run out of Eastern Europe. by, troll farms.
Mhm.
So there's this huge amount of manipulation due to the lack of transparency. And what I would say is there are these design flaws, and then the extremists and the grifters make use of those design flaws in order to manipulate people. And so I think if we can, if the FBI is doing its job as it was this weekend, and then if the platforms are making it harder for people to be manipulated, I think that would go an awfully long way. If they were more transparent about their algorithms, if they were more transparent about ads, if they were more transparent, and then on top of that, if they really enforce their rules much more evenly and much more strictly, I think that would make a big difference. Because I think it's easy to get sort of hopeless, but I think there are ways that this can be chipped away at.
And
So
Sarah, I just want to add really
Yeah.
quickly that with the QAnon militia connection, it seems sort of odd, but in fact, there's a pretty powerful through thread there, which is a fundamental distrust of authority figures,
Mhm.
or of the, like the mainstream media or what they are telling you. So there's just this, the mistrust and the conspiracy theories are combining and collecting and sort of attracting a lot of these
Right.
seemingly disparate groups and people.
Right. And Jessica,
They're
has
feeding
there
into
been-
each other. Can I just say another thing? The groups online, you see, mothers who are afraid that autism may be caused by vaccines, may be attracted into a, anti-COVID vax, may be attracted then into a reopen Michigan, and you see these groups converging in really frightening ways that you wouldn't expect from normal political divisions.
Yeah, that's
Right.
a great point.
Right, like, or the yoga instructor against vaccines then getting funneled into other right-wing
Yeah.
conspiracy theories. But something I was curious about after, listening, we keep coming back to Carol in North Carolina, but Jessica, has there been any research done on the level or rate of radicalization of people who weren't necessarily looking for it? Like they weren't, on the internet searching for white supremacist manifestos. They were just, on Facebook hoping to, share some photos of their new puppy and share some recipes with some friends. And then they end up getting pushed into, getting fed into their feed information about a militia movement. Is there any research on to what extent people actually get sucked into that sort of thing by that route?
I've not seen specific numbers, but just based on our research and based on, the assessments that we've done on a lot of these platforms and just sort of what we've seen as paths to mass shootings or to extremist events, I would say that the number must be very, very high, because there are so many cases in which after the fact, we will read about, oh, I was angry about something that happened at school, so I went online, and then 3 months later this person is deeply ensconced in the incel movement, or goes from Jordan Peterson immediately over to white supremacy. If you have any kind of sense of grievance, or if you are frustrated about anything and you go online to find like-minded people, and it can be about paying taxes, it can be about why aren't they fixing the potholes? It can be about, or it can be about why is the government forcing us to get vaccinated? Almost immediately, and we've seen this on YouTube, we see it on a lot of other platforms, as Karen mentioned, the algorithm will feed you into increasingly extreme environments, and you will become more and more, they hope, sort of embroiled in this conspiratorial and extremely agitated mindset. What I wish, and maybe they do, but what I wish Facebook executives could see was just sort of the degree, the temperature that gets raised so quickly, and the incitements to violence and the incitements to destroy other people's lives. It is so fast. And it is so disturbing to see it happen in real time. And certainly, we've all witnessed it. Researchers have all witnessed that happening, either from the beginning or in retrospect. It is truly it is something you will never forget once you see the trajectory in real time.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about YouTube for a few minutes? Because I think we've been talking a lot about Facebook. It is the most used social media platform in the world. And so obviously I think it plays a really important role, and it's important to understand it and how these algorithms work, and how, the what was revealed by the Facebook whistleblower and so forth. But YouTube, obviously a lot of people watch stuff on YouTube, and its algorithm also, like if you watch one extremist video, its algorithm is going to feed you more extremist videos. And the autoplay feature, which you have to turn off if you don't want autoplay, right? So like if you haven't turned it off and you watch one extremist video, at the end of it, it'll just start the next one that the algorithm has queued up for you. And I feel like there's some anecdotal evidence, at least, that I've seen just in reading and listening to podcasts and things like that about online radicalization. But has there been any sort of systemic study of how people get radicalized on YouTube because of the way it is set up, and that there are these YouTube influencers, like people who are trying to promote their own career in this space, whether it's QAnon or anti-vax stuff, right? And like then, viewers get sucked into that. I mean, Jessica or Karen, or both of you.
Yeah, I think the report that Karen was referencing was actually done. We did that in 2021. It was our Belfer Fellows out of the Center for Technology and Society at ADL, and it showed that the rate to conversion from essentially normal videos or mainstream videos to full-on white supremacist videos was very, very quick. I think they put it at maybe like a 2 to 3 video leap. So just imagine, you're online, you're looking at cat videos or, whatever happens to be happening that day, panda videos. And, there's going to be things on the side there, as Karen has illustrated. They want to keep you there for as long as possible. So they're going to sort of set up some options for you on the side into your feed. And if you choose something that, happens to sort of skew in a certain direction, they're going to keep pushing you down that path. And so the distance between the cat video and then the Hitler speech is, 2 or 3 clicks, which if you think about how much time kids, especially young people, spend online and how enmeshed they are in that world, that's just an incredibly alarming number and just a wildly dangerous trajectory.
One thing I wanted to add, Sarah, is how important sort of the cross-platform aspect to this is. So Jessica's already talked about these fringe platforms where some of the worst content goes.
Right.
But we've also seen, a really interesting example for us was in Texas when the power went out in the winter. We saw spun up these conspiracy theories that it was really caused by frozen windmills and the Green New Deal, which has not been passed even to this day, was really responsible. And we saw it happen within, a couple of days. Go from, there was an actual meme, actual picture on a tweet that showed a frozen windmill from Sweden from years before. There was an actual article that was written in a reputable newspaper about how there were some frozen windmills, but it was of course put in context and it didn't blame the outage for this. And then quickly that was taken and distorted, and you saw a Facebook story and somebody putting it on their YouTube channel, and the audience for it grew and grew. So within a couple of days, the White House was being asked, why did the Green New Deal cause this power outage, or could you refute this? And I've had reporters say to me, it's so frustrating. Why won't the White House refute it? And they were put in a terrible spot because they didn't want to give it more oxygen. But on the other hand, it was ridiculous. And what it left people with was this confusion. Is it deregulation that caused this? Or is it actually, renewable energy is just not reliable? And again, what we see there is, it's not that the platforms wanted that to happen. It's just that there aren't, people aren't literate about what to trust. and then things come at you in your news feed or recommendation because there's an interest in pushing it. You know, it's not that the platforms are necessarily designing it and want this outcome. It's just that they're the design of the system that you're interfacing with. It allows others with interest, whether it's financial or political or whatever, to get at you in ways that are sort of sneaky.
They know how to exploit the way it's set up.
Exactly. They know how to exploit the design. Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. So what can be done? Is there a, you know, I know that conservatives are often complaining that social media disproportionately censors them or silences them, and would view, but then at the same time have sort of a muddled complaint about whether government should get involved in regulating social media more. What's your view? What's the role of government here in, you know, regulating the social media companies? How can anything be done to make the algorithm less toxic? And then maybe also, you know, one of the questions I see in the Q&A is whether there's a role for the government or for Congress to make it, the questioner asks, to make it impossible for the manifestos to be available online. So those are two different questions, but it's both going to the role of government here, and maybe you can take each of them sequentially.
Why don't you go ahead, Jessica, and then I can pipe in.
I think that the solutions aspect of this will be much more in Karen's wheelhouse, but I will just say that, you know, there are, you know, always going to be social media platforms that operate outside of the rules. So Gab, for example, refuses to be moderated. Telegram has resisted for a very long time. As long as there are spaces online that are not, that refuse to be subject to certain rules, these manifestos and videos and horrible inciting comments and forums will continue to exist. Now, if there were
say they won't subject themselves to the rules, these are rules that are created by the social media industry, right? So like Facebook and Twitter might say, we're gonna ban any anti-vax material or any openly white supremacist content. Right. And this isn't something the government told them to do. This is something they decided to do on their own.
Correct. And some of these companies are based not in the United States. I mean, you could argue, okay, well, you're using American, you know, Wi-Fi to operate, so therefore you are subject. But there's a whole conversation going on globally with a lot of different governments. And again, this is Karen's space, but like, you know, the EU has a very different attitude towards online speech and privacy and the right to be forgotten and that sort of thing than the American government does. And Britain has a totally different view. And then you get into, you know, South America, and there's absolutely no coherence, or, you know, there's no bottom line across the board internationally. So I think that also causes some challenges. So I've just queued up another challenge for Karen, who can talk about solution.
I mean, I think part of the solution is definitely in Jessica's part of the world, because I think what we've seen is that, you know, although the FBI has made it super clear that domestic extremism is the gravest threat to violence, we've seen in numerous instances where they haven't taken it as seriously as they might have. And so I think there's a whole discussion there. But I think as far as what happens online, again, I think we want to be really careful and really thread the needle so that we're not creating a system where the government can enforce its political views. You know, we give it too much ability to get involved in content police so that they can enforce their political views. We have to be really careful about that. And I've felt that, you know, all the more strongly over the last few years, and I've been studying this. But so I think some things that are really important, there's a privacy bill that's just been introduced in Congress. So California now has a very strong privacy bill and a privacy law, sorry. And so that's going to have a big impact on the whole country. And that's important. But now there's a move to get a federal privacy law. And that would do a lot, because a lot of that machine that I was talking about, the algorithm, is fueled by data. A lot of it's about data about the content, but a lot of it's data about you. So it would make a big difference if there was a strong privacy law, as there is in Europe. Although it's not being enforced really strongly there. We actually have better enforcement in a lot of ways than in Europe. There's a lot of move on the Hill for more transparency. The biggest bipartisan push is for researchers to get access, which is unbelievable that even researchers can't get access to data to tell us in the rearview mirror what happened. The only way we know that in 2016, one of the things the Russians did was suppress the African-American vote and turn others against African-Americans and Muslims is because this data, the Senate Intelligence Committee really strong-armed the platforms into giving data to researchers. There's nothing on the 2020 election. So that would be a really important one. But there's also bipartisan legislation on more ad transparency. There is not nearly as much ad transparency as there is in broadcast television, which is really important if you're running political ads. So this 2000 Mules film that Dinesh D'Souza has, purporting to claim that it proves without a shadow of a doubt that there was all this fraud in the 2020 election, which even Bill Barr said was nonsense. Candidates for Congress are running ads with that linking to 2000 Mules. So there has to be like a lot more transparency about the ads, a lot more and there should be sort of know your customer, like who's really paying for this, not just the name of the front organization. And then there needs to be much. I think that when the platforms hold out that these are their terms of service, and then they're not putting the muscle behind it, or what we found is that over 5 million people were exempt basically from the terms of service of Facebook. It's almost like a deception. And so I think there's a consumer safety, consumer deception aspect to it. And there's also a consumer choice aspect, I think, that we should think about, that consumers need to know that they have a choice about what kind of moderation they want. What do they want to see? Is that going to help the teenager in his basement? No, although he and his mom could have a conversation about it, but it could help Carol in North Carolina if she were given more choice and more knowledge. And I'll just say one thing and then I'll shut up, Sarah, which is one of the things that we're really working on, and it feels like rolling a boulder up a hill, but it's very encouraging to me because at least the boulder goes up a little bit, as opposed to waiting for Congress, is we're working on helping civic organizations be better at amplifying facts. And we're working on 2 pilots, one that's in a certain state, we're not public about it yet, focused on election administration information, and we're going to be launching another one on public health with public health community. And what we're just trying to do is help everyone understand that we're all influencers now, and that we have to get networked with our networks online, and that we have to speak out. And when we see something that's factually incorrect, that we tell people where they can get the facts without getting into a fight, and as opposed to amplifying the incendiary thing like everybody else is doing. And we have to do a better job at pushing out the facts and saying, this is how I know it's true, this is where I got it from. So we're going to be doing some of that work in a couple areas to try to get some metrics about what works and what doesn't.
So you had mentioned, or you and Jessica had mentioned, that we know that domestic extremism, we know this from Department of Homeland Security, FBI reports that domestic extremism is on the rise. We've talked about how it's spread through social media and it sort of metastasizes through social media. And to what extent is that kind of domestic extremism that law enforcement has identified rooted in anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories? And how much is that driving what's happening in terms of the rise of extremism and in terms of the the social media metastasizing of conspiracy theories and joining groups and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think what the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have said is that right-wing extremism is the greatest threat to our sort of domestic peace. And I think it's important to, I'm always very careful to, remind people that it's incredibly, not that I have to remind anyone here, but just, I just want to make clear that we can't both sides this. This is not a left and right situation. We are looking at disproportionate threats from right-wing extremists, including white supremacists, including militia groups, the plot to kidnap governors 2 summers ago, and the ongoing, uncovered plots that we've seen since then. So I just want to be clear on that. But also, I just want to say that there is, as I mentioned before, I mean, anti-Semitism is such an animating force behind so much of the extremist world that, it's hard to tease out exactly how anti-Semitism, plays a role in each right-wing extremist belief system. Militias are probably the least impacted by anti-Semitic tropes. The militia movement in the United States was based in part on white supremacist ideology and at its inception in the last 20, 30, 40 years. What was essentially an overlapping circle. The Venn diagram has separated very significantly, and there's sort of a sliver of overlap now between white supremacy and militia movements. And when I mention white supremacy, I mean in all of its, with all of its ideological trimmings. So, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the sexism, all of the things that come with that. White supremacy, obviously very anti-Semitic. And I think, as I mentioned before, the sort of the expressions of anger around changing gender roles or around changing societal norms, quote unquote, is very much part of this line of grievance that a lot of right-wing extremists have. And again, they do many of them blame the Jewish sort of power structure.
George Soros.
Yes, George Soros, the perennial boogeyman of the right. That they claim that George Soros and his minions are controlling all of this and making all of this happen. So you cannot talk about right-wing extremism without talking about the very powerful undercurrent of anti-Semitism that animates so much of it and is just such an important thread for these groups and these people and the way that they think about things. But it's interesting because I think if you talk to some people, you would say, some people, even those who subscribe wholeheartedly to a right-wing extremist ideology, you might say, do you understand why this is anti-Semitic? And they'd be like, I'm not anti-Semitic because I'm pro-Israel. So you get some of this weird, cognitive dissonance around, especially on the right, and then that goes into the whole idea of this Christian nationalism that, follows to evangelical beliefs, which follows to the idea of Israel existing for very specific purposes. Right. So, it's all there, but a lot of people don't want to talk about it, and a lot of people don't want to admit it.
So, one of the people in the Q&A asked, so what does highest do? One of you had mentioned the Tree of Life shooting, and that the shooter there had a grievance against highest, which helps immigrants and refugees resettle, and is currently helping Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war there, Our audience member is asking, in order to refute anti-Semitic comments, how would you explain what highest does? How do you refute that assumption of the shooter? But I wonder if refute the assumption is even the way of going about it. Not that you'd necessarily change the shooter's mind, but I guess how do you combat those sorts of conspiracy theories when you take a humanitarian organization and it's been demonized that way?
Well, I mean, the first thing you do is you enact real repercussions for public officials who demonize immigration and immigrants. And that's been going on for years and years and years. You know, you see entire countries being referred to in certain ways. You see public officials talking about, you know, asking, why can't we get more immigrants from Norway? And we all know what that means. So, you know, like, we can start by holding people accountable for their racist language that feeds into this idea that somehow there is this, you know, international cabal that is funneling people into the United States to change the demographics and the voting patterns, as well as other things. So we can push back against that. We can call for Tucker Carlson to be taken off the air, as we have done. We can call for, you know, all sorts of things to happen. I'm not hugely optimistic that that will happen, but you know, we can keep trying.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Karen?
No, I mean, the one thing I wanted to return to was you had mentioned I think Jessica had mentioned the European landscape and how it's different and the same. And, you know, in Europe, there are hate speech laws, and in the US, there are not. And I'm not sure anyone would question in America that should change. I don't. I think we shouldn't have hate speech laws. I don't want to speak for anybody else. But what the thing they are doing is they've said, look, it's not enough to wait for something illegal to happen online and then for somebody to have to go to the platform and say, hey, there's this illegal stuff that's online with incitement to violence. Now take it down. What they're insisting through their new law, their new Digital Services Act, is on the front end. And I think this is interesting, even in our legal context. On the front end, you need to do a review of what's happening on your platform that's allowing this illegal content to happen. Because think about it, by the time somebody's put incitement to violence online, it's really too late. So on the front end, what's going on? And I should say, be really clear, incitement to violence is illegal, even in the US. That what's going on, what's causing it, what remediation steps are you going to have? And then there's a level of transparency about that, and the regulators looking over your shoulder. And then there's an audit to see if you're putting in place those remediation mechanisms. So I think even in our legal context, if we imported pieces of that kind of concept of, you know, let's be transparent about what's going on these platforms, and let's hold the platforms accountable for taking actions on the front end from stopping it, I think that would be a help. Is it going to solve everything? No, but I think it could be a help, as opposed to waiting now until it's, you know, next to causing the next incident.
Right. And this will be the last question that I'll pull from the audience. Sorry that I couldn't get to all of them. This is sort of an interesting question, I think, for you, Karen. Somebody asked, if I Google something such as immigrants, does that mean that then on Facebook, I'm going to get pushed information on immigration?
There is, I don't know the specific answer to that, but Facebook does track across the internet even if you don't have a Facebook account, you can be tracked, and it's very hard, but it's worth doing to try to stop being tracked. One of the things that happens when you search, the extremists do this thing that researchers have called, I think it's Data and Society that came up with this term, keyword stuffing. So if you see an odd term like critical race theory or immigrant caravan, part of the reason that weird phrase is being used is because there's not a lot written using that language that's going to be accessible to you. So they'll generate a lot of content. So when you search, you say, what is an immigrant caravan? And you search, what comes up is a bunch of the conspiracy theorizing. And that's not because Google wants it to, it's because, again, a loophole has been exploited in a way that manipulates you. You think you're looking for actual facts, and what may come up before the platform can catch it is a bunch of stuff that's meant to radicalize you.
So I did say that was the last question, but just one more, because one of our audience members wants to know the reasoning behind your opposition to anti-hate speech laws.
Oh, me from a First Amendment perspective, I just think, you know, and I don't see the Supreme Court changing their mind on that. The thing that is interesting that this is happening in the Supreme Court is, I mean, a lot of these things, strangely, are in contention for all kinds of variety of reasons. So Clarence Thomas has said, as an aside, that he thinks that platforms should be treated like common carriers, so almost like the telephone company is. And there are these two laws in Texas and Florida that would get at what you were talking about earlier, Sarah, which is to say that content moderation is seen as infringing on people's speech and is biased. And there are various penalties associated with sort of bias in the content moderation. And one of these went up to the Supreme Court. And although I think it's a complicated series of events, but it was much closer than anybody thought, in part because these issues are so complicated and everybody's sort of grappling with them. So it came out as you would expect, that it was seen as a First Amendment issue, but I think there were some questions among the justices about how are we going to grapple with a lot of these details.
Right. I think that those are issues that we're going to continue to grapple with.
Yeah. Did I answer your question about hate speech? Sort of. Okay.
I think so.
So, okay, well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I want to thank Sarah and Karen and Jessica for joining us for this extremely, extremely important conversation. I wanted to let everybody know that I will send out a follow-up email later in the week that will include some links of resources that both Karen and Jessica have provided, along with a link to the recording of today's program. I encourage everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can read more articles on this topic and other articles related to anti-Semitism. And please register for next week's Zoominar. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.